other 10 bills of rights that is very important for us to maintain our freedom and protect us against the tyranny that this Obama administration wants to put forth. So it's very important that we protect it. This crowd is going to do that.
I'd like to welcome everybody here to the Metro East Pachyderm meeting. It's great to see such a large crowd. I can't believe we've got a crowd like this. This is a little bit better. Can you hear me better now? Okay, great. I'll just hold it. I'd like everybody to stand, and we always open our meetings with a pledge, so if you would all stand and join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Yeah, I'd like to give some special thanks to some folks that worked so tirelessly to put this together. Mary Gray, our first vice president. Mary had this vision of getting somebody from the NRA. She didn't really care who she got. She wanted somebody from the NRA to come speak to us. So she started putting out some feelers. She worked with Don Carlos. Guy, where are you? I had some contacts, the Sturgises, Keene and Danielle Sturgis. Without them, we're looking at I also want to recognize some VIPs that we've got in the group. Senator Sam McCann, State Senator from Illinois. Tim Buchanan, St. Clair Township Supervisor. Melinda Hall. Where are you, Melinda? Jason Plummer. Everybody together knows Jason. Nick Miller is St. Clair County board member. Mary Carroll, St. Clair County Township, St. Clair County Township clerk. John McLean, who's chairman of the St. Clair County Central Republican Committee. And Greg Bridgman, who's a trustee for the St. Clair Township. I hope I did not miss anybody. I hope not. So.
Myron Neff.
Oh, Myron Neff. Myron is the chairman of Monroe County, correct? Republican Committee. And Jerry Albrecht, who's an alderman from O'Fallon.
Andy Crothers.
GOP Chairman Manager.
Andy Crothers?
He's here.
Where is he? Anybody else? Okay, I want to extend I would like to extend a personal invitation to everybody to attend one of our regular weekly meetings or our monthly dinner meetings. We meet in O'Fallon on Friday lunch meetings at noon at the 17th Street Barbecue. And on the fourth Thursday of the month, we have a dinner meeting which starts at 5:30. On those weeks where we have the dinner meeting, of course, there is no lunch meeting. Just a little bit about the Pachyderm Club for those of you who don't know. We're an organization that provides a means for citizens to become involved in politics. We promote political, practical education through topics, speakers such as what we have here tonight. We promote the development of political leaders in our community, and we assist in carrying out the principles and purposes of the Republican Party. So that's basically what we're about. We have a great time. Like I said, we get together every week, and if anybody's interested in joining our club, come out and just, you're welcome to come and join, attend without being a member, but we certainly would love to have you as a member as well. This time I'd like to introduce Mary Gray again, and Mary is going to tell us a little bit about some of the upcoming events that we've got scheduled, and introduce our Jason, who's going to introduce our speaker. Oh, one thing before Mary comes up, just a couple housekeeping things. I think everybody found where the restrooms were. We do ask that if you have cell phones on, if you put them on vibrate so they're not disruptive to the speaker. And during Mr. Keene's talk, if you would hold questions until after he is done speaking, that would be appreciated. Thank you. Mary?
I guess I gotta hold this with my glasses and a piece of paper. Okay. Our guest speaker for our April 12th meeting is James Herbert Harrison. Mr. Harrison writes contemporary books with a political thriller style approach. Incidentally, he is also a self-described avid NRA member with extensive knowledge of Civil War small arms. The April 17th Pachyderm Club meeting, our guest speaker is Lauren Spivak. He is also known as the Free Market Warrior. He devotes much of his time teaching about free market economics and conducting economic literacy seminars. I'm not sure if Mr. Spivak is an NRA member, but I'll be sure to ask him and have an application ready to hand to him. And introducing tonight's guest speaker is someone who's near and dear to many of us in this room. Jason Plummer is a local businessman, entrepreneur, and an officer in the United States Naval Reserves. Jason, like most of us in this room, he's a fervent gun enthusiast, a proud NRA member and supporter, and a strong advocate for the protection of our Second Amendment rights. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce Jason Plummer.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for being here. And before we get too far into the speeches, I'd like to thank everybody from the Doubletree for helping put this on. They've done a phenomenal job. And we're not here to sell stuff, but let me tell you, if you have not taken the time to go to a Pachyderm meeting, if you haven't taken the time to visit their website, learn about all the wonderful things they do, it's a great organization. They do a phenomenal job, and I really encourage everyone to get out there and get more involved, because you won't find it's not just a group of like-minded individuals, it's a group of friends, and you guys will really enjoy it. So please look into the Pachyderms. Yeah, absolutely. We're really blessed today to have David Keene, the president of the NRA, here. I was talking to him earlier, and he said since last September, he's been on the road at least 4 days a week advocating for our Second Amendment rights. And we appreciate that very much. We appreciate all you do. For those of you that aren't familiar, local trivia, Dave Butts, phenomenal football player, St. Clair County resident. He's also on the board of directors of the NRA. wasn't able to make it tonight, but look Dave up sometimes and realize that St. Clair County, Madison County, the Metro East is represented well at NRA headquarters by Dave Butts, so we'd like to thank Dave for everything he does as well. If you haven't taken the time, get to know the NRA. It's not just, it was actually fascinating. I was sitting in on Mr. Keene's media interviews. It's not just lobbying and advocating. It's education. It's the Friends of the NRA banquets. It's everything they do to advocate the Second Amendment, to educate about the Second Amendment, and we're just truly blessed to have him here. I was thinking about coming up here and saying, okay, raise your hand or stand up if you're a member of the NRA, but I don't want you to, because I wouldn't want to embarrass anybody that's not in this room. So, because I saved you from that embarrassment, in return, I ask you to go home tonight and go onto the NRA's website and become a member. Become a member of the NRA. I know we've got endowment members here, we've got life members, we've got regular members. There's nothing more important than you can do for this nation, for your government, than to join the NRA to protect the Second Amendment, because the Second Amendment protects all of our other rights. Just keep that in mind. So, appreciate appreciate you all looking into that. I really would. So, without further ado, the person you're here to listen to tonight, I've got a lengthy bio, and this is one of those bios that there's a lot of things left out, because this is a person that's done a lot of things. He was an advisor to Vice President Spiro Agnew. Since then, since the Nixon administration, he's been a senior advisor to every Republican president through George W. Bush. You all probably have heard a lot about the UN Small Arms Treaty and everything that's going on over there. Yeah. Absolutely. Mr. Keene was a delegate for the United States on behalf of the George W. Bush administration. And when he was there, we were able to run out the clock and do great things. And he's done a lot of things. The official bio reads as follows. David Keene was first elected to the NRA Board of Directors in 2000, and most recently served the NRA as first vice president. Mr. Keene currently serves as chairman of the Legislative Policy Committee and vice chairman of the Meeting Site Selection Committee. He's also a member of the President's Committee on Advancement. Since 1984, David Keene has served as chairman of the American Conservative Union, the nation's oldest and largest grassroots conservative lobbying organization. He's also a managing associate at the Carmen Group, a lobbying firm in Washington, D.C. David Keene is an attorney, columnist, political activist, and lobbyist who has written, spoken, and lobbied on behalf of hunters, shooters, and firearm owners for decades. He has worked in the White House and Congress and has been involved in nearly every congressional battle over gun rights since the early 1970s. David Keene attended the University of Wisconsin Law School, where he was the national chairman of the Young Americans for Freedom. Most importantly, native of Illinois, hails from Rockford, Illinois. So, I don't know what it says that the president of the NRA comes from Illinois, the only state without concealed carry, but I assure you this, no one works harder to make sure that gets changed very quickly. Without further ado, the president of the NRA, David Keene.
I will take questions. Somebody asked me if I was going to do that at the end, and I said yes, because I usually don't talk about things you want to hear about. It's best at the end for me to have a chance for you to get us talking about the things that do really interest you and the things that really concern you at this point. I'm glad you mentioned Dave Butts. He's a great member of the board of directors of the National Rifle Association. I have to tell you, though, for those of you who know him, he is a great shotgun shot. And not only that, and I'm only telling this story because it's his home area and you can make fun of him for it. He claims, as he claimed about my wife, that he can teach anyone to use a shotgun better than I can. Now that's not a high hurdle to jump, but it nonetheless was a claim that he made. and he was going to teach my wife to beat me at sporting plays and the like. So last year I was invited as NRA president to go to Nebraska to something called the One Box Pheasant Hunt, and I couldn't go, so I asked Dave to go. And they pick teams and assign people to it. And to his team they assigned actually a country singer who, when they went out for the first round, had to inform the rest of the team that he was legally blind and couldn't actually hit anything. And Dave is a former NFL player, a very competitive guy, and so they finished last. And I had to inform the NRA board that Dave had been less than honest with me because I put him to the test. He said he could teach anybody to shoot, and he failed. So that'll give you something the next time you run into Butts, and he deserves it. I'm really happy to be here tonight, and I know that being in Illinois and being a gun rights supporter is not easy. Sometimes being a Republican in Illinois is not all that easy. But I do want to, I'm going to talk briefly about the National Rifle Association. Many of you know as much as I do or more about it. Val Rosenkrantz over there. Val, stand up. She's been a member since the 1940s. Active in raising money through the NRA Friends Dinner to support shooting activities here in Illinois, and for that we're very grateful and very thankful. We're very involved, as you know. Illinois, we were involved in the lawsuit that has challenged Illinois' right to deny concealed carry permits to everyone. It's the only state that's never allowed concealed carry permits at all. And it looks like Illinois is going to have to modify that as a result of court action that we've all had. But you know, I've been, as was mentioned, I've been running around the country. Wayne LaPierre has been doing the same. All of our friends have, because we're facing a real challenge to the Second Amendment and to the rights of those who enjoy the shooting sports, who use firearms for self-defense, who collect guns, who believe in the Constitution, for gosh sakes. A real challenge. But when I think about it and I go back, I remind people of where the National Rifle Association came from. You know, the NRA was formed in 1871, following the Civil War. And it was really formed by a group of Union generals who concluded that there was a real problem developing in this country because the North was recruiting in the newly industrialized cities of the Northeast, and they were recruiting people who came from countries with no gun culture. Many Northern soldiers, the first time they ever fired a gun was on the battlefield. They had no training whatever. And of course, back then the saying was that one Confederate soldier was worth 3 Union soldiers, and the problem was there were 5 Union soldiers for every Confederate. But when the war was over, it was decided that Americans were in danger of losing their familiarity with firearms, which were not just such an important part of our culture, but of our history and of the reason that we were a free nation. And the NRA was formed to promote civilian ownership and training and competition with firearms. And among our first presidents were Phil Sheridan and Ulysses S. Grant, generals who served in that war. Between 1871 and 1970, the NRA never endorsed a candidate. The NRA did not have a lobbyist. We did not have a lobbying arm. The NRA was not involved in political campaigns. There was no need for us to be involved in politics. The NRA is not and was not a Republican organization, though we all here are Republicans. In those days, life members of the NRA included everybody from both Roosevelt's to Dwight Eisenhower, Hubert Humphrey, and John Kennedy. That changed. That changed in the 1970s, the late 60s and 70s, with the beginning of what we now know as the culture wars in this country, and the domination of one of our great political parties by an extreme leftist element that began to look at the country in different ways than Americans of either party had in the past. It began with the Gun Control Act of 1968 that was pushed through by Lyndon Johnson, but it was a bipartisan thing. 2 years later, Richard Nixon's Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, announced a plan that would have resulted in the confiscation of all privately owned sidearms by the 1980s. Teddy Kennedy, not that old a senator at that time, announced after the Gun Control Act of '68 was passed that it was a good first step on the road to confiscation of private firearms in this country. That was the goal then. My friends, that's the goal today. It can be stated in any way that they want, but every step they take along that road is just another first step. What Kennedy didn't realize, what they didn't realize at that time, was that this wasn't a first step. This was their high point up until today. It was their high point because what they'd done was woken up Americans that cared about the Constitution, that cared about their rights, but that hadn't previously been concerned about them. You know, the legislative arm of the National Rifle Association was formed when a Democratic congressman from Michigan, who's still serving, John Dingell, came to us in the early 70s and said, you can train as many people as you want in firearm safety and storage. You can run as many competitions as you want. You can have as many certified instructors as you can train, and it's not going to matter unless you step up and save and defend the Second Amendment, because nobody's going to be allowed to have a gun in this country if you don't take on that job. We did. And today, when you're on the street and you ask somebody what the NRA is, they see us primarily in that role as the advocates for Second Amendment rights. And that is a crucial role and a core part of the mission of the National Rifle Association. But even today, even with the fights that are going on, that takes up about 10% of our budget and our activities. The rest of it goes to what it's always gone to: training and safety and the handling of firearms, running of competitions. We work closely with the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, the 4-H, with homeschooled kids to bring new people into the shooting sports, to teach them how to handle firearms and how to be involved. That's the core, that's the other part of the core mission of the NRA, and it's just as important as defending our Second Amendment rights. Today, those rights truly are threatened, but we have a president, and you know, we caught a lot of flack during the last campaign because we dared to suggest that if Barack Obama were reelected, he'd go after our Second Amendment rights. Remember, during the campaign, he said, I'm a believer in the Second Amendment. He said that yesterday. But he said it during the campaign, and he said, I'll not take your guns, I'll not take your rifle, I will not take your shotgun, I will not take your sidearm, because I believe in the Second Amendment. We suggested that that was not true, because he had a lifetime record of opposition to Second Amendment rights in this country that dated back to before he ever ran for public office. We were derided for taking that position. One of the more level-headed journalists in America, Chris Matthews, actually suggested that Wayne LaPierre, our executive vice president, was clinically insane for suggesting that Barack Obama would ever go after the right to keep and bear arms in this country. In the summer before the election, the United Nations was ready to deliver to the president the small arms trade treaty that was finally voted on this week. The White House contacted the United Nations and said they wanted action postponed indefinitely. Why? Because that treaty would have landed on the president's desk in August, which meant it would be in the Senate or in the debates over the presidency in September and October. And one thing that this president realized as he was running for re-election was that he did not need to wake up those who believed in the Second Amendment, because the consequences could be serious. So they asked for a delay. 2 hours after he gave his victory speech in Chicago, a letter was dispatched from the State Department to the United Nations saying, we want that treaty on the president's desk as soon as possible. And the UN agreed to a March date when they would meet, have final consideration, and vote on it. That vote's taken place. That treaty is on the president's desk. When that letter went to the UN, I told people who had been doubters that that's a clue, that perhaps we were right. And then the Newtown tragedy occurred. And the entire Obama administration turned on a dime and said, this is our chance. This is our chance to do what we wanted to do all along. We can use this. We can use this to go after Second Amendment rights. And we've got Michael Bloomberg, who said, I will spend $1 billion if I have to help get this done. You can't spend all your time taking away people's right to drink 16-ounce soft drinks out. We have to have other things to do. And they thought that the world had changed. Remember the narrative that the president gave when he talked. He positioned himself as the most reasonable man in America. He said that he had suggestions as to how we could fix things that would have been passed already, but for some evil special interest. That would be us. But that members of Congress and elected officials didn't have to worry about us anymore because it had all changed. First of all, we didn't represent hunters and collectors and shooters. Not anymore. We're simply shills for the gun industry, trying to sell firearms. I looked into it at the time and discovered that we do, in fact, raise money from the firearms industry. Last year, we got 4% of our revenues from the firearms industry, and I felt like sending all the gun companies a letter saying, if this is even partially true, we need more money. Because we don't represent firearms makers, though if there weren't any firearms makers, there wouldn't be any firearms. We don't represent gun dealers, although gun dealers are important because if there's no place to buy a firearm, the Second Amendment doesn't mean anything. We represent not just our members, the 4 to 5 million people who are now our formal members, but the 30 to 40 million people that the Gallup poll says consider themselves members of the National Rifle Association. And most importantly, we represent the Second Amendment to the Constitution and the values that were bequeathed to us by the founders and those who came after. And the president's narrative, remember, think about it in December and January, what was going to happen. We were all going to be steamrolled. He was going to get his way. It hasn't happened. Yesterday, his chief of staff told a reporter that the president wants to sign something. And he was asked, well, what does that mean? Well, anything they send him. This battle is still going on. This war is still going on in Washington. It's not over yet. But what's happened is that the American people, and this is the key, the American people are standing up. I stood before a crowd in the rain in 30-degree weather in Albany, New York, the week after the governor up there ran through legislation that was more insane than anything that's gone through any state house in recent memory. It made felons out of 80% of all the police officers in New York, for starters. It included unconstitutional provisions. They've already had to go back twice and try to revise what they passed that day. It was in the rain, and there were 10,000 people in front of that state house that were outraged at what had happened. I talked to a congressman who's an A-rated congressman from the NRA, and he said, you know, this was some weeks ago, he said, in the last month I've gotten 5,000 calls from my own constituency. He said, we counted. And he said, they've all said, basically, we know that you voted for the Second Amendment in the past, but that was then. This is now. We want to know what you're going to do today and what you're going to do tomorrow. And he said, you know, what would it be like if I was on the fence? When the President in his State of the Union talked about how we need to vote, remember that refrain? That wasn't directed at us and at you. That was directed at Harry Reid. Because Harry Reid has one desire in his life, and that's to keep the word majority in front of leader. And he does not put his people at risk. And he do, and they know, that if they did what the President was asking them to do, they could lose 6, 7, 8 members of the Senate in the 2014 elections. That's why the House, Speaker of the House, Boehner, has basically said, Harry, I've got some guys over here who'd like to be senators. You go ahead. And maybe they will be. Well, most of what the President wanted is not going to happen because of the American people. And there's a lesson in that for all of us. The reason the National Rifle Association has had the influence it has is not because we raise as much money. We don't have anybody that's ever offered us $1 billion. It's not because we have all this power that our critics claim we have. It's because we share the values of most Americans. Most Americans care about the Constitution. Most Americans understand the importance of the Bill of Rights. This week, and we've been arguing with the Congress, the one piece of legislation or part of their package that's the most dangerous is what they call universal background checks, because that sounds so reasonable. Sounds like a good idea. You know, under the bill that Chuck Schumer has in this package, let me give you an example of what would be a crime. Not just the purchase of a firearm, but what they call the transfer of a firearm. My daughter is in the Army Reserve. She served 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. She owns 1 gun. She owns 1 gun. She has an AR-15. She's familiar with it from the military version, from the fully automatic version she carried in both of those countries, and she keeps it. If she were activated and she had to put that gun in the hands of someone else while she went off to serve her country, she and the person whose hands she put that gun in under the Schumer bill would be felons. That's the kind of thing that we're facing in the Congress. And that's the kind of thing that as time goes on and people understand it is going to result in the defeat of those sorts of pieces of legislation. But the lesson is that if we stand up, if we understand what the threats we face are, and this doesn't just go in terms of Second Amendment rights, it goes across the spectrum. You know, here in this room we're Republicans. Did you become Republicans because you wanted a job? Did you become Republicans? Somebody said a few months ago that the only reason for the existence of a political party is to acquire and exercise power. Did you become Republicans because you wanted to acquire and exercise power? No. You became Republicans, you got active in politics for the same reason most people do. Because you care about the country. You care about the values. You care about what's been passed down to us. And you want to preserve those values for the future. That's why we're here. Not because we're Republicans or Democrats or Libertarians or whatever, but because we care. And a party that cares, and a party that runs and talks about its issues, its beliefs, and its traditions and its values is a party that can succeed. And that's the lesson of the history of the National Rifle Association. We, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, and all the people that make up the NRA have one thing in common. We care about the Constitution, we care about our rights, and we have said from the beginning that we will not compromise on those questions. And that's something that resonates with the public and with lawmakers. And that's something that in the final analysis makes all the difference. And there's a lesson there, not just for us, there's a lesson for the Republican Party and for others that are involved in politics. All I can say about the president, I don't want to say too much, is that one of the things that's amazed me is the 10 years that he's had in terms of the values that we all hold as Americans. It's not just the arrogance of ignoring Congress and trying to reinterpret the Constitution for his own ends, something that I didn't know was one of the things the president gets to do. But it's the disdain that he has for Americans not in his own circle. You remember back in 2008 his comment about those who were bitterly clinging to their guns and their Bibles. And just last week he said, you know, if my wife lived in Iowa, I could understand why she might need a gun. What was that all about? He doesn't think that anybody outside Washington and Chicago really count. And one of the things he's learning during this debate is that Washington and Chicago are not the center of the universe. I'm often accused, and I want to get into, if you're interested, into some of the things, the specific things that are actually going on right now, the challenges we're facing. But I said at the beginning I was going to take questions because otherwise I'd continue to talk about things that I wanted to talk about rather than things that you wanted to talk with me about. So what I'd like to do now really is take your questions about what's going on in Washington, what we're doing, what's going on in the states, how we can work together, and what lessons there might be in it for others. So there we go.
Okay, my question is in regards to states' rights. As you know, Colorado has come up with some wacky laws regarding guns, and I'm sure the other states are following suit. And I'm sure Illinois will also be coming up with some wacky laws regarding gun ownership. What is the NRA doing to try to educate or stop this?
We're involved, as I said earlier, we're involved in the most serious challenge, really a war against the Second Amendment. And what happens in war is sometimes you lose a battle here and there. But when the war is over, you go back and you mop up, because this is a war we're not going to lose. Actually, the problem we're facing in some of the states is worse than the problem that we're facing in Washington. Two of the states in particular, one of which I'm a resident of, are New York and Maryland. Both one-party states. Both states that are headed by governors who, for some odd reason, think they ought to be president. And both of whom are using the gun issue to appeal to the most lunatic parts of their own party in the hope of getting primary votes if they do, in fact, run for president. Now, they're doing what some people accuse some Republican candidates of doing in the last cycle, appealing on issues that would mean they weren't electable in a general election. And in the short term, these people are making their constituents suffer by depriving them of their constitutional rights in an effort to further their own political careers, but they're so blind that they don't know that what they're doing to themselves is committing political suicide. And what we've done, and what we're doing around the country in these instances, in New York, we're in court now, because much of what they're doing is unconstitutional, to start with. Let me give you an example. Then I think this is one of the reasons that the Senate leadership, Harry Reid and the others, sort of looked at Dianne Feinstein and said, that's very nice, this so-called assault weapons bill you got, but we're not going to really take it seriously. One of the reasons they're not taking it seriously is that the Supreme Court, in the Heller decision, was very clear on what you could and could not do in terms of restricting fundamental Second Amendment rights. You can restrict those rights, just as you can restrict free speech rights in the First Amendment. But you better be very careful when you do it, because it's looked at very critically by the courts. And the Supreme Court, it was almost as if the majority said, you know, I'll bet some lunatic's going to come back with this proposal again. So what they said was that while you can have reasonable restrictions on Second Amendment rights, one thing that you cannot do is you cannot ban a firearm that's commonly owned and widely used for legitimate purposes. It was almost as if that paragraph was written with the AR-15 in mind, which is the poster child for these people. The AR-15 is the best-selling long arm in this country. It has been for some years. It's owned by over 4.5 million American citizens. It's the single most used gun for long arm training. It's used in competition. It's used for home protection. It's used in hunting. And it's almost as if that paragraph was written for that firearm. And unless the president changes the makeup of the Supreme Court, those bills are ultimately going to fall when they get to the Supreme Court, and we're going to get them there before he can change them. In Colorado, do you know that in Colorado there are more registered Republicans and independents than there are Democrats? And yet 4 guys, billionaires, put up, I think it was $115 million over the last 4 years to take over Colorado, and did. I was out there. I met with the governor. I met with the leaders of both houses as this stuff was rolling through the legislature. And the Speaker of the Assembly, when I met with him, informed me, first of all, that he was their first gay speaker. And I thought, well, what's that got to do with anything? Yeah. But then he said, there's something else you ought to know. Before I came out here and ran for office, I was legislative director for Senator Schumer. My reaction was, well, where do we go from here? They voted that stuff through. And they, including him, are now facing recall elections. And we're going to be involved in it. Our mission is to protect the Second Amendment. We're not going to go away tomorrow. You know, I talked about the Gun Control Act of 1968. The Firearm Owners Protection Act, which fixed that, wasn't passed until 1983. We didn't give up between 1968 and 1983. If, for those of us who, except for some of the young kids here, those of us who were around then, on any side of this issue, if in 1968 you had said that we would enjoy the Second Amendment rights today that we do in fact enjoy, if you had said, do you know that by 2013 that there are going to be concealed carry laws in 49 states? Do you know that all these things are going to happen? Everybody would have said, that's ridiculous. That's not going to happen. It's happened because people stood up and fought for their rights and didn't give up. You know, at Christmas time, Bill Clinton warned Barack Obama about all this. He said, you know, Mr. President, this is a road you should go down very carefully because you may not know what's at the end of it. Bill Clinton knew what was at the end of his road. It was 1994 when he took on the Second Amendment in the early 90s. Barack Obama is learning that now. And hopefully that's going to have some real impact in a couple of years.
We have seen that probably the Second Amendment is probably going to be pretty well defended. Are y'all watching out for what I think would be the next level attack, which would be the businesses that sell guns, the gun dealers, and the federal licensing of them?
Yep.
It would seem to me that the government's attack on that would be the same type of attack they did to coal companies, which is make us unbusiness, where they can't run a business doing it.
But this is an all-fronts attack that's going on. And, you know, one thing that happens when you have a president and you have this huge bureaucratic operation that is the United States government, the president wants to do X. Bureaucrats know what he wants to do, and they think of inventive ways to do it. One of our larger outdoor and firearms retailers in this country for the last 2 years has been under active investigation and has been spending a lot of money defending itself against the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which now operates on something called disparate impact, and is going around saying that if you don't hire felons, you're a racist because there are more minority group members in the felon population than in the general population. So they've said these people are in violation of the civil rights laws because they're not hiring felons. The retailer's lawyer said, well, we have a problem because we're a firearms dealer, and it's against federal law for a firearms dealer to employ a felon. And the investigating attorneys from the EEOC said, well, that would be your problem, wouldn't it? Not ours. That's harassment because of where the president stands. That kind of thing is going on. The Department of Homeland Security, a week or so ago, knocked on a door in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and asked a gun collector if they could see a Polish firearm that he had. He showed it to him. He was very proud of it. They seized it. They said it had been stolen from the Polish government during World War II. He said it was a trophy that was taken in Germany from a German soldier. These weapons went to the Germans after they overran Poland, and he had papers on it. And they took the position that the Department of Homeland Security has jurisdiction over any weapon brought into this country at any time. We've been getting calls from collectors all over the country because what they're trying to do is assert jurisdiction over anything that was captured in any war. They said it was stolen from the home government. The weapons that were brought back that were taken from the Nazis are really weapons that should be returned to the Germans because they were taken from them and stolen by our people. These are bureaucrats who are trying to please the boss. And one of the things, you know, when the Heller decision, which affected specifically the District of Columbia and said you had a right to have a firearm in your home for self-defense purposes, the district government said, this goes to your question, said, okay, we recognize that, the Supreme Court has spoken, but you have to buy it here. No gun dealer in the district. Now, after the district was forced to write a check to us for $1 million for legal fees, the city council said, maybe we better do something because we don't want to write all these checks all the time. So they went back. But if there were no gun dealers, there'd be no guns. You know, when the NICS system, the instant check system, was set up in the 90s, we supported it. And then at one point during the Clinton administration, they starved it for money because the law said if you went to a firearms In order to buy a gun, you had to be cleared through the system, and they realized that if the system wasn't working, you couldn't buy the gun. We had to go to Congress and lobby for the money to get that system, keep that system operating. So there are a million ways that a government can go after your rights and after the Second Amendment. And if they haven't thought up the entire million yet, they're working on it. So we're involved on all fronts in this sense.
And the ammo.
And the harassment of federal firearms licensees is one of the major ones.
Sir. Yes, sir. Excuse me. First of all, I want you to know it's gratifying to see a president speak without a telephone.
The advantage of the teleprompter is that at the end of the sentence there's nothing else to say, so he doesn't talk as long.
Recently, the President Obama has said something about if Congress doesn't act, he's going to do this, gun bans and universal registration or background checks by executive order. Should that come to pass, what's the recourse?
The recourse is that if an executive order is issued, in order to accomplish what the executive order requires, costs money. And that money has to be appropriated by Congress. And Congress can pass legislation denying appropriations can be used for that purpose. And if he tried that, and there are some things he can do and many things he can't by executive order, but if he tries that, we'll be there to deny him the money to implement the order. You know, let me talk for a second because you raised this whole thing about the universal background check. I mentioned the hypothetical of my daughter and her firearm. The negotiations, and there were a number of Republicans or a number of gun supporters, Tom Coburn of Oklahoma, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, a Republican or Democrat, who were trying to work with Chuck Schumer to find something that would be agreeable. Wouldn't have been agreeable to us, but something that might get through the Senate. And they said the one thing that they would not participate in was anything that established a national gun registry. Schumer said, go away then because we're going to have one. That's what this is all about. Because Schumer, Cuomo, Feinstein, and others have talked about what they call forced buybacks. In other words, if the record that you own a gun, they can say you're either going to sell it to them, to the government, or you're going to become a criminal. Federal law prevents the establishment today of a gun registry. It's one thing that we will not accept. And interestingly, this week the American Civil Liberties Union came out on our side on this one and said we don't need a gun registry. We don't need to keep
Just today I spoke with one of Mark Kirk's people in Washington, and he informed me that Kirk himself was writing a universal background check bill.
Kirk is the one Republican who's working with Schumer on this.
Yeah,
That's true.
progressive.
All Kurt's office.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Others that were working, Senator Manchin and others have heard from their constituencies very strongly and realize they better not go down that road. Mark Kirk doesn't realize that.
Yeah. He's a total fraud.
What are you doing with, or what is the NRA going to do with respect to education more broadly? I have two daughters, a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. Not only do they know how to field strip a pistol and clean it, but they also understand the various parts and how it functions, unlike representatives from Colorado. And what I'm wondering is, what is the NRA doing to change the dialogue? Part of the problem is people who are advocating with these legislators that are trying to take away our rights don't understand. The president just yesterday said the shooter at Newtown had an automatic weapon. People don't understand when they hear the word semi-automatic, they assume machine gun. People hear magazine.
The president does know the difference.
He does know different. That was deliberate. But what is the NRA doing to educate so that when people are on the same page, and I have colleagues who are not necessarily pro-gun, but once you explain things to them, there you go, oh, and it changes the tone quickly.
I mean, that's a major part of our job. That's what I do. I go around and talk to anybody. You know, It's very interesting because I spoke to about 600 students at Harvard not too long ago, and answered questions for about an hour. Most of the questions reflected the sort of bias you might get if you were an undergraduate at Harvard. But when they heard the answers, not all, but some of the students reacted as you said they might if they heard that. The other surprising thing was, I guess the administration at Harvard thought that the students were going to attack me because there was more security there than I'd seen in any other speech that I'd given. There were the Harvard police and the Boston police, and they were all there to protect me, presumably. And what these kids couldn't figure out was when the program was over, after they spent an hour calling me a criminal and saying I was responsible for all the various things that those of us who support the Second Amendment are responsible for, 30 cops lined up to have their picture taken. Because they were all lifetime members of the NRA, and most of them were certified instructors. And I won't say which one it was, but a high-ranking police officer with the Harvard campus police came up to me and made a big point of saying, "Thank God you come here to try and drill some common sense into these kids' heads." That's our job. And that's what we try and do. We can't get to everybody, but I've said I'll talk to anybody, I'll go anywhere, I'll explain these things to the extent that I can. You know, it's interesting because our assumption from the very beginning, right after Newtown, when it looked like they were going to roll all this stuff through, was that if the American public and American legislators had an opportunity to really think about it and discuss these things, that it wasn't going to be as bad as they expected it was going to be, because people have common sense. You know, I've been in politics for Lord knows how long, and I've always operated on the assumption that the people that we deal with are smarter, with the exception of people in this room, of the folks that we elect. And there has been nothing that's happened in the 45 years or so that I've been involved that has convinced me to change that opinion. And when people reach their legislators, when people reach their congressmen and senators, when enough of them say what they're going to be, even somebody like Mark Kirk, who is after all influenced because he's too close to Northwestern, get the message. Because they know who ultimately approves their paycheck. And that's not the guys in Washington, it's the folks back home. And that's really what democracy is all about. And the common sense of the American people is the one thing that we have that saves us, because they believe, as we do, in the Constitution.
This is more of an observation than a question, but one of the concerns I have, and I think it's safe to say everyone in tonight is full Second Amendment, but being a very staunch NRA member and pro-Second Amendment advocate, I have any number of friends of mine who share my beliefs, but when I ask them the question, when is the last time you conveyed your opinion to your elected officials? They look at me and say, I have never called an elected official. This is a concern I have, it's a problem we have, and I would encourage everyone here tonight to go out and talk to your friends and get them to make contact and express their opinions.
That's exactly right. As I say, when we all speak, they listen whether they want to or not, because they know what the consequences of not listening is. But too many people don't do that. Fortunately, within the Second Amendment community, you know, when this battle started, we had about 4 million members. We're right about 5 million right now. The greatest membership day in the history of the National Rifle Association was the day that Barack Obama delivered his speech on what he wanted to do about the Second Amendment. We had 58,000 members, and our poor people worked for 24 hours answering the phone and putting people on hold. We didn't have a recruitment drive going on, but people stepped up. More and more people are stepped up. You know, the history of the country, and you are exactly right, but the history and one of the reasons for the strength of this country is that this is not France. We didn't fight, we are not a people, you and I might be, but we're not a people obsessed with politics. Americans established a free country where they could raise their kids, they could live their lives, they could earn a living, they could do the things they wanted to do without interference by government. And they were not and have not been hyperactive politically. That's been a strength and one of the reasons for the stability of this country. But the other aspect that's unique to the American culture is that whenever we perceive as a people that our rights are threatened, we've stepped up to the plate. Whether it's been an international threat, which we've had in different generations, or a domestic threat, which we have now. And more people are getting involved as they realize the consequences of not being involved. But one of the things we have to do is make our neighbors realize what those consequences are. That's part of our job. You can pay me later.
Thank you very much for being here with us. Secondly, if you would speak very briefly on what the NRA is doing to help our Illinois State Rifle Association and make an influence on our concealed carry issue. And lastly, if you could speak some on the National School Safety Shield Program with Asa Hutchinson.
So this is a 2-hour speech here.
Yeah.
You know, we work very closely, as you know, with the Illinois Rifle and Pistol Association. Richard Pearson is on one of our committees. We're very involved here in the concealed carry fight. Our attorneys have been, in fact, argued on appeal for the case. We're helping in any way that we can, and we'll continue to do that. We don't, you know, just because you're living in firearms hell does not mean that your friends are going to abandon you. I can tell you that. You know, I even actually go to California. You think Illinois is something, you should be out there. And we're going to keep it up, and we're going to work with you here because Illinois is like New York. You know, once you get outside of the New York City and you get upstate to New York, it's part of America. Yeah. It's a little bit like leaving Cook County. But let me talk for a second. You know, after the Newtown tragedy, when we first came out, there was an irony because the day after Newtown, I was in Israel. And it happened that I was touring the facility where they train school security guards for their schools. In Israel in the 1970s, they had a whole spate of school shootings. And as I put it when some reporter asked me, I said, you know, the God they talked to was different than whoever the voice was that's been talking to our crazy people, but the results were the same. What initially then happened was that Israeli military veterans flocked to the schools as volunteers. And over the years, that program morphed into a system where each school is responsible for its own security. The military doesn't provide it, the police don't provide it. Each school has private security, and those people are trained. The courses are very much like an advanced concealed carry course in this country, in which these folks are trained, certified, and then can be hired by a local school district. When I came back, and Wayne LaPierre was thinking in the same way, we said, you know, we cannot as a society guard against every lunatic. The people that involve themselves in mass shootings are not your traditional criminal. That's gun crime. The people that do this are people that, you know, after the Newtown shooting, we were called by the American Psychiatric Association, which was outraged at us because we said this guy up there was crazy. And they said, we don't like people saying that. We said, well, actually we were trying to think how to describe him. It was the nicest thing we could think of to say. Yeah. But literally, that's the kind of people that engage in this sort of thing. And they're not people that envision themselves as warriors. They're people that want to find a killing field. That's why the Aurora shooter went to the only theater that did not allow firearms, did not allow concealed carry firearms to be in the theater. That's why he was looking for unarmed victims. That's why schools have become killing grounds, because the killer, these people know that they can get away with it if they can accomplish their objective before help arrives. So we suggested we ought to think about security in our schools. And everybody said we were crazy. Then the Gallup poll came out and said the first thing we ought to provide is security in the schools. And the president said, well, maybe it's just a bad idea, it's not crazy. And then it turned out that 30,000 schools already have security. Rahm Emanuel may not like it, but every school in Chicago's got 2 cops. Of course, there may be part of the problem for all I know in Chicago. But the fact of the matter is that what we did then is we said the question being addressed by the administration is the wrong question. The question the president was asking in the wake of the tragedy in Newtown was, what do we do about guns? We said the question should be, what do we do to protect our kids? Those are separate questions, and they're very different. So we asked Asa Hutchinson. Asa, for those of you who know him or know of him, Asa was a former U.S. attorney who served in Congress. He was the head of the Drug Enforcement Agency, and he was the #2 man in Homeland Security. Knows more about this kind of thing than virtually anybody in the country. We asked Asa to put together a task force, and he did, of experts, including a former director of the United States Secret Service, and we said, look at the schools. Go out and talk to people and come back and tell us what should be done. They did. They last week issued a 215-page report with a whole series of recommendations to the federal government, to Congress, to the states, talking about infrastructure protection and things that the schools could do in that sense, and then suggesting that every school should sit down, do an assessment of its safety and what it needs, and look at the possibility and look at how it can provide armed security. Some schools have police officers, what they call resource officers. Some of those are paid by the federal government. Most of them are paid by state and local governments. Some schools have private security. There are some schools that have armed teachers and administrators right now. This isn't just something that's going to happen. It's happening now. And some schools are using volunteers, retired police officers and veterans that are in the area who get additional training and then are allowed to provide security in those schools. There are a whole series of ways you can do it. In one school, and I found this interesting, you know, my brother was a cop for 30 years, so, you know, cops spend an inordinate amount of time filling out paper. And so in one jurisdiction, what the police did was worked out a deal with the school, so instead of going to the precinct to fill out the reports, they go to the school and are given a desk there and they do their paperwork in the school. That doesn't cost anybody anything. And they have armed, uniformed people in the schools in that jurisdiction all the time at no cost. What we said and what Asa and his team said was, all of these options are fine, but the one thing we have to guarantee is that the people who provide this security, whether they're public, private, or volunteer, or school personnel, really need to have training. And the one thing that the NRA knows how to do is to provide instruction in firearms handling. And it has to be more than a concealed carry permit owner would get, because they have to have training in active shooting situations. They have to know how to deal with a school. So they're working on developing a best practices training manual and training model for security for public and private schools that the NRA will offer to schools that are interested in that. That's our contribution. The other thing we talked about, obviously, is the other big problem, and that's mental health. We're not experts in mental health. We do know a little bit about guns. We do know a little bit about what works and what doesn't work and what kind of training people ought to have. And so that's the part we're taking onto ourselves. But we're hoping that others will pick up on other parts of this report.
First of all, a point, and then a question. For those of you that have seen my name, I've already been asked 3 times tonight. As far as I know, I'm absolutely no relation to Mark. I sent him a letter several years ago after a couple of his votes and finished it off with the statement, "You make me ashamed to have the same last name." Yes. Awesome. If any of you know him, tell him that. This so-called Department of Homeland Security in the last couple of months has bought 2 billion rounds, enough to train for more than 100 years, supposedly. Not of training ammunition, but of killing ammunition. We can't find ammunition. Do we have any alternatives?
Well, they're really, and that's part of the problem. Although the contract that's talked about on the internet is a 5-year contract, which is not unusual, where they're buying training ammo into the future, and it's not being delivered now. But nonetheless, the government's buying a lot of ammunition. And the real problem it's not just Homeland Security, although they have a lot of agencies under them. You know that the Department of Education has a SWAT team. Today, every agency of the government has got its own army, and that sucks up a lot of ammo just to keep them trained. The only law enforcement people in the country that aren't trained are the New York City Police Department. But they could use some of that ammo, believe me, up there. But that's part of the problem. The other two problems right now are, one, panic buying on the part of a lot of people because they expect taxes or other kinds of regulations to go on to ammo purchases. So the public's been stockpiling. And then there's a longer term. It's not a problem. You know, firearms are much more popular today than they were 5 years ago or 3 years ago or 2 years ago. There are literally millions more people that are in the shooting sports. You know, I use the example that 5 years ago, if you wanted to go into a small business and go bankrupt, my suggestion would be to start an indoor shooting range. Today, they pop up all over the country. They're all making money. They're all busy all the time. People are shooting up millions of rounds of ammunition. And frankly, the ammunition producers haven't really responded to that as well as they were. So you've got a perfect storm that's driven up the costs and wiped out the supply in a lot of areas. I think that's going to take care of itself. It'll take care of itself for two reasons. One, the producers are going to ramp up. Two, the government isn't going to be able to get all of this ammo that they want, or they'll be taking it as they usually do. And thirdly, if we, in fact, win these battles we expect to win on the Second Amendment issues, then the panic buying will go away and things will revert to normal. But all those things together have created a really bad situation right now. Any more?
Over here.
Oh.
One of the things we should consider is executive orders. And the executive orders were formed initially by Congress for the President to carry out what they passed. They did not authorize the President to issue executive orders on things not related to congressional action.
Right.
Right now, is there any move to restrict the President's ability to issue executive orders?
Well, what I said earlier is that if he tries to do anything in the area that anything requires money, and the most direct attack on it is if he orders you to do something, Congress can say no appropriated funds can be used to do that. That's the way you can stop it. A lot of this has happened, frankly, over the years because in Congress, both parties have abdicated their responsibility. They let the President do these things. The founders believed that every politician was avaricious in the seeking of power. And the reason that we had the balance of power and the separation was that the Congress was going to jealously protect its prerogatives. The executive was going to protect its prerogatives. They were each going to try and take it. And this competition was going to keep things in balance. We've had a docile Congress for a long time that has said, it's why we have a regulatory state that passes a law and then says, well, go implement it. We don't want to take responsibility for that. And so regulators are making laws. The President issues orders on this, that, and the other thing, and Congress doesn't object. That's where that has to come from.
I sent a note to Shimkus suggesting he introduce a bill to avoid any executive order that was not directly related to an act of Congress. Mm-hmm. He refused to do it.
He's weak.
Well, that surprised me because John's a pretty good guy.
Yeah, but he's weak.
That does surprise me.
Is the United Nations thing they're talking about this last week a threat to our Second Amendment rights here? And if so, is there anything?
It's a long-term threat.
Long-term?
I don't think that the treaty can be ratified. I don't think the votes are there in the Senate to ratify it. Before the election, 58 senators from both parties issued a letter saying we won't vote to ratify such a treaty. I don't think that number's changed very much. I don't think the President can get it ratified, but that doesn't make it any less of a danger. One thing that a treaty is like a vampire. It lives forever. And once it's passed, it sits at the desk in the United States Senate so that if you had a sea shift in Senate control at some point, and the votes were there, they could bring it up and ratify it immediately. even if it's not ratified, and I use the example of the Kyoto Treaty that was passed and that was signed by Bill Clinton in the 90s. He didn't even submit it to the Senate because he knew they wouldn't approve it. But he went around trying to get some parts of it done. And internationally, other countries and the International Court of Justice and others will look at these things and say, oh, well, they should apply to the United States, and we're going to try to apply it. So it's a danger. It's something we have to worry about. I don't think it will be ratified, even if it was, to act. It's a little bit like the executive orders at that point, because in order to really do anything, it requires additional congressional enabling action, and the votes aren't there for that. So is it a danger? Yes. It has to be watched. It has to be fought. We have to make sure it's not ratified and that there isn't any implementing legislation. But it's not the end of the world at this point. Oh, there he is.
Hi, sir. There's another issue that's kind of going around, and it's not getting covered as much, but that's of the FEMA. Like FEMA, there's a law out now that would actually give FEMA the power to detain American citizens in the case of an emergency, basically. So, is there really anything that's going on in order to try and stop this, or you think this is really going to affect their Second Amendment liberties?
Well, let me give you an example of what was tried before. And the fact is, when we talk about international treaties or when we talk about government actions, can somebody threaten our rights? Yes. Can they get away with it? Not as long as the system works. When Katrina hit in Louisiana and Mississippi, the first thing that was attempted down there was to go and confiscate firearms. They said that would make it safer. Actually, disarmed the victims, and there were thugs traveling around, looting and doing all this. We went to federal court, and the federal court said, and it's now settled law, that the government does not have the power in an emergency to deny firearms to individual citizens. Would they want to do this? Yes. Can they get away with it? Not as long as the system works, and if the system stops working, it's over anyway. No more questions? Oh, there she is. She's been waiting.
Mr. Keene, I do have a serious question as far as we, as NRA supporters and members, and coming from history from being veteran, a prior veteran myself, retired service member as a husband, huge family members, populace that come from the core roots of West Virginia, and family members of mine who led the march against Joe Manchin personally. We consider ourselves patriots. I mean, literally, truly standing up to support our patriotic right, constitutional right, Bill of Rights, etc., or not just Second Amendment rights, but our rights across the board. And we as patriots are now under attack across the board from the left, the media, you name it. We're being quoted as domestic terrorists. We're being lumped into a group. This is new rhetoric. To some of us, it's old rhetoric, but it's resurfacing, and it's coming about with a vengeance. And we consider the NRA leading advocates for our patriot movements, our Second Amendment right movements. What are you doing at the NRA level in encouraging us and at your level to squelch that entirely across the board, so that then we in turn, get identified as that threat that he was just talking about, right, that allows them to indefinitely detain us for being a threat to national security, because we're patriots exercising our rights.
It's the kind of thing that you have to always be on guard against. We attack it wherever we see it. It was interesting because a few years ago, I hadn't thought about it this way, but Mitch Daniels, who was then the governor of Indiana, was asked to speak on the Second Amendment at a dinner in Las Vegas. And he had asked me for some thoughts about what he might say, and I gave him my thoughts, and he threw them all away. And I'm really glad that he did, because what he said was actually much more important. He said, he had given it a lot of thought as to the importance of what the NRA does and what those who support the Second Amendment do. And he said he thinks that the attack on the Second Amendment the response of the NRA and its membership and those who believe in the Second Amendment has in itself done more to educate average Americans about the importance of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights than every course that's ever been taught in any school. And he said he sees that as governor who saw that. And I'd never really thought about it that way. But when I did think about it, I think he might be right. And it's interesting because I had meetings with folks from the ACLU, and they came in this week and they said, you know, the Second Amendment is part of the Bill of Rights. And you can't pick and choose. Either this amendment means what it says, or the other amendments don't mean what they say. And that's really what it's all about. And you can't tolerate, which what we have now, and I think I referred to it earlier, a president who thinks he can just redefine the Constitution and just say it means something that it doesn't mean. You've got Michael Bloomberg and Barack Obama running around saying that anything that they do is consistent with the Second Amendment. That just ain't true. And they don't get the right to rewrite the Constitution for their convenience. And as citizens, it's our job to make sure that we stand up for that document. Because, you know, there are a lot of Americans who think that America is what it is just because it is. It isn't. It's what it is because of the foundational documents that the framers put together. That's what's made it work. And if you change it, it won't work anymore. You know, and when I talk to young people, I'm going to end this, but I'm going to tell one story because my wife says I'm always telling too many stories. But some years ago in Moscow, there was a banquet honoring General Kalashnikov on the occasion of his 85th birthday. He's now 93. And after this banquet, we made the general an honorary member of the National Rifle Association. And let me tell you why. Russia doesn't have that many heroes. They had 70 years of time when they could destroy most of their heroes. But he's one of them. This is the man who was a tank driver in World War II and in his spare time invented the AK-47. So they had this banquet, and Mr. Putin got up to give the toast. And then General Kalashnikov got up and held his wine glass right in front of Putin's face and said, Mr. President, my dream is a country like the United States, governed by men and women not afraid of an armed citizenry. And then he sat down. And you know, think about it. We live in that country. We live in a country that other people can only dream about. And as long as we are alive and breathing, we're not going to give up the country that we inherited. It's that simple. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, very much for your presentation and your thoughtful words of advice and encouragement. I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I'd like to thank the staff at the Doubletree for providing an excellent venue for our session here. And with that, everybody have a safe trip home, and thank you again for